I'm Dr. Judy Malinek. I'm a board-certified forensic pathologist, and I just watched the Nolan Wells press conference, and I wanted to share some context for everyone. Being able to definitively state the cause of death after a body has not been found for several days and has been subsequently autopsied twice with signs of decomposition is incredibly unlikely. Drowning is what's called a diagnosis of exclusion, which means that when you've got a fresh body, you want to be able to look at the body and see if there's any other causes of death for that body that is found in water that exclude the death being exclusively a drowning. So, for example, if someone is shot and then thrown in the water, you'll have that gunshot and they'll be bleeding and the gunshot will be the cause of death, and the thrown in the water is not the cause of death. It's not even on the death certificate. If a person is strangled and they die from strangulation and then their dead body is thrown in the water, their body will take on water, but the cause of death is going to be strangulation, not drowning. Also, for any kind of traumatic injuries. Now we got to talk about natural death for a second. If someone has a heart attack while they are swimming, and because they're having the heart attack as they're exercising in the water and they take on water and they drown, the cause of death is actually drowning, and the heart attack is listed on the death certificate under other significant conditions contributing to death. So even though the heart attack might have killed them on dry land, it might not have. Most certainly they wouldn't have drowned on dry land. So we defer to the hostile environment, which is the water, to call it a drowning. Now, identifying natural disease and identifying trauma is relatively easy in a fresh body. It can be very difficult in a decomposed body. His body was found 2 days after he disappeared, and this second autopsy done by Dr. Roger Mitchell wasn't until 4 days later. So we're dealing with quite a bit of decomposition, even if the body was refrigerated during that time. And then we have this other issue of the fact that not all the results are back. The toxicology would have been done on the fluids from the body from the first autopsy. From the second autopsy, you're going to have a lot higher alcohol levels from the decomposition caused by bacteria, not caused by drinking. So again, it's the fluid and blood from the first autopsy that really matter. And the other thing you have to consider, and there's one other important piece of information from that press conference, which is that the neck block, the portion of the neck from the front end, was missing. So Dr. Mitchell did not have a chance to examine that part of Nolan Wells' anatomy. Why is that important? Because if somebody is strangled, especially manual strangulation, the injuries are going to be to the front of the neck. There may be some redness at the back of the neck as well if, injury comes from behind, but generally this part of the neck doesn't have the major blood vessels and the airway. It's the front of the neck that does. So compression or damage to the front of the airway, that's going to be found in the neck block that is still sitting at the medical examiner's office that was not released with the body. So you may ask, is this common practice for pathologists to keep a portion of the anatomy with them at the medical examiner's office and not release it to the family? And the answer is yes. We will sometimes retain important specimens that have pathology in a jar under formaldehyde at the medical examiner's office for further examination or as evidence. And the absence of that neck block is really important because we still don't have information from the first autopsy that has not been released yet. So we don't know if it was kept out of an abundance of caution, meaning that it didn't have any findings and it was negative, or it was kept because it has findings, because there's a broken hyoid bone, or because there's hemorrhage in the strap muscles. Until we get that first autopsy report, we don't know why it's been retained. So why should anybody do a second autopsy? A second autopsy is often done in cases where there is a high-profile case such as this, or there is concern from the family for foul play, and they're just not getting answers from the medical examiner's office because the medical examiner's office is still doing their investigation and is keeping things under wraps, because if there is foul play, they have the evidence, they have the physical evidence that might be able to trap the killer, and they don't want to release that to the public. Even if there is no evidence of foul play, just the lack of evidence is evidence and is important information that might affect how people are interrogated, whether they're going to tell the truth or not the truth about what happened to him. You have to understand that the medical examiner's autopsy is legally mandated, and it is ultimately the most independent autopsy because it's not beholden to the family, it's not beholden to the prosecutor, to the police, to anybody else. It's an independent agency. So that is an independent autopsy, but it takes time. And it takes time until we get all the information back, including the toxicology report. And to answer the question, if somebody's intoxicated and they drown as a result of their intoxication, meaning that they're just, too intoxicated to be able to swim adequately, the cause of death would still be a drowning, but the intoxication would be considered a significant contributing condition. But because of what I said about alcohol forming from bacteria after death, if the body is decomposed, you have to subtract some of that alcohol because it may have been caused by bacteria and may not have been a sign of intoxication. And you can have up to 0.20 gram percent. So 0.08 is above the legal limit in most states for driving, but you can get up to 0.20 in a massively decomposed body. So it really throws you off when you have decomposition and alcohol to try to figure out whether there was alcohol on board or whether all of it's just been made by bacteria. So I hope this answers some questions about what I saw in the press conference, what other people saw as well. I will go through the autopsy, or at least the report that's been released with a fine-tooth comb, but this is just my first impressions based on watching the press report.
You just heard a board-certified forensic pathologist with no connection to this case at all walk through exactly why one specific question still can't be closed. Not because something sinister is being hidden, because of decomposition, because of missing tissue, because that's genuinely how forensic medicine works when a body has spent days in salt water. Hold on to the one sentence that matters more than any other in what she just said. Being unable to rule something out is not the same as finding it. That distinction is about to run through everything else in tonight's update, because almost every other piece of commentary on this case has been collapsing those two statements into one. It's worth understanding why that collapse keeps happening, because it isn't unique to this case. An open question is uncomfortable to sit with. A closed one, even a false closed one, feels like relief. So a pathologist saying, "I can't verify this and I can't eliminate it either," gets quietly rewritten, somewhere between the clip and the comment section, into, "The pathologist thinks this happened." Nobody necessarily does that on purpose. It's just what an unresolved gap tends to become once enough people pass it along. Tonight, we're going to try not to do that, even where it would make for a cleaner story. 4 things happened since our last update. A man was arrested, the first arrest connected to this case in any form. The state's own autopsy was finished, and immediately sealed. And Nolan's parents stood in front of a crowd 800 miles from Mississippi and said something that's rippling well past this one case. Let's take them in order, and let's be precise about what each one actually confirms. If you're new here, that's the whole job of this channel, pulling apart what's actually confirmed from what just sounds confirmed. Subscribe so you're here for whatever comes next. Start with the arrest, because it's the one most likely to get misread in the first 10 seconds. Federal agents tracked down and took into custody a man named Joseph Alfredo Vasquez Dumar. He was located in Sacramento, California, a couple thousand miles from Mississippi. And I want to be exact about what this arrest is, and just as exact about what it isn't. This is not an arrest for Nolan's death. It's not an arrest of anyone who was on that boat, or on that island, on the 4th of July. Dumar has been charged with something separate, and, in its own right, just as serious. Sending direct, specific death threats to a Mississippi judge. That judge is Ashley Cole. If her name is new to you, here's the connection. She's the stepmother of Warren Hudson, one of the friends who made that trip to Horn Island with Nolan. Her husband, Warren's father, is the one who later put up a substantial reward for information leading to answers in Nolan's death. Cole herself had posted publicly early in this case, defending her stepson and laying out her family's version of that afternoon, that Warren last saw Nolan around 3, that the boat left roughly 90 minutes later because of mechanical trouble, and that Nolan had chosen to stay behind. Days after that post, she was back online, not defending her family this time, but showing the public what had landed in her messages since. Threats, specific ones, naming her office, describing a package on its way. Language built to terrify, not just to insult. I'm not going to read those messages to you word for word, and I want to explain why. because the reasoning matters more than the restraint itself. Repeating the exact language of a threat, even to condemn it, gives that language a second life it doesn't deserve. What matters isn't the specific phrasing. What matters is that it was specific enough, a named office, a described object, a directed target, to cross the line from ugly online noise into something federal prosecutors take seriously. That specificity is exactly why this moved as fast as it did, from an anonymous account to a name, an arrest, and a courtroom. Here's how that anonymous account became a named one, and it's worth explaining because it's a genuine contrast to some of what circulated elsewhere in this case. According to reporting from the Sun-Herald, agents working an FBI task force traced the account back through its login history, the email tied to it, the IP addresses behind those logins, eventually a phone number and a physical address. Anonymous accounts still leave footprints. Platforms keep that data, and federal investigators, working with that cooperation, can follow it all the way to a real person, even one who believed they were untraceable. That process is exactly the kind of methodical, checkable work that led straight to Dumar. It stands in real contrast to some of the audio speculation that's spread elsewhere in this case, where nothing comparable has ever been verified. It's worth pausing on why federal jurisdiction attaches so easily to a case like this one. A threat doesn't need to be about Nolan's death directly to become a federal matter. It only needs to cross a state line to reach its target. And in an era where a message can travel 2,000 miles in the time it takes to hit send, that threshold gets crossed constantly, whether the sender realizes it or not. That's precisely why an account operating out of California could end up facing federal charges over words aimed at a woman in Mississippi neither of them had ever met in person. Distance doesn't offer the anonymity people assume it does. The charge itself is worth reading plainly, because the language is precise on purpose. Federal prosecutors allege that on July 11th, Dumar knowingly transmitted a threatening communication across state lines, specifically, a direct message threatening to kill Judge Cole. That falls under federal law governing interstate threats. If convicted, he's facing up to 5 years in prison, a fine reaching $250,000, and up to 3 years of supervised release once any sentence ends. So here's what this arrest actually establishes, and here's what it doesn't. It confirms, in a documented, prosecutable way, that at least one person sent genuine, credible threats to a woman targeted purely because her family sits near this case. It shows federal law enforcement is not just aware of these threats, but capable of finding the people behind them. What it does not do, and I want to be direct about this, is move the central question of this case forward at all. It tells us nothing new about how Nolan died. It resolves nothing about those final hours on the island. A lot of commentary around this case treats every new headline as though it must shift the center of gravity. This one doesn't, and pretending otherwise does a disservice to both halves of the story. The real harm done to a judge and her family, and the separate, still wide-open question of what actually happened to Nolan. No grief, no suspicion, no frustration with how slowly this has moved justifies threatening anyone connected to it. Not a judge, not a teenager, not a grieving parent. Dumar's arrest is proof those threats carry real federal weight. And it's worth knowing that Mississippi's own public safety officials have said threats connected to this case haven't stopped at just one family, meaning this arrest may be the first of several, not the end of the problem. Now, the second thread, the state's own autopsy, the one performed back in early July, is finished. And as of tonight, it is sealed. Nolan's family has not seen it. Their attorney has not seen it. And I understand exactly how that lands for anyone watching this. A family that has fought this hard, for this long, for basic transparency, still can't see their own son's completed findings. But here's where precision matters, because sealed and hidden are not the same word, and this case has already suffered from that confusion more than once. Jackson County's district attorney has confirmed that every unnatural or suspicious death in that county, with narrow exceptions for natural deaths and non-criminal accidents, goes to a grand jury as a matter of standard, unbroken procedure. Evidence connected to those cases stays out of public view specifically until that grand jury reviews it fresh. That's not a decision made about this case in particular. It's the same rule applied to every comparable case in that jurisdiction, regardless of who's involved or how much attention it's drawn. And there's a real reason that rule exists beyond this one situation. Releasing autopsy findings before a grand jury sees them risks shaping public opinion, and potentially witness memory, around information that hasn't been formally weighed yet. That risk doesn't disappear just because a case is high profile. If anything, it gets larger. Put that next to what Dr. Melinek said in the clip you just watched. She called the medical examiner's report the most independent piece of evidence in the entire process, precisely because it doesn't answer to the family, the prosecutor, or the police. It answers to the evidence itself. And she was equally clear that getting it right takes real time, including waiting on toxicology that a decomposed body makes genuinely difficult to interpret. A pathologist with zero stake in this case and a prosecutor following a decades-old county rule are describing, independently of each other, the exact same principle. Thoroughness costs time. It also, for a while, costs the family and the public an answer they're owed. There's no announced date for when the grand jury process wraps up. That means this waiting period doesn't have a finish line yet, and that uncertainty, stacked on everything this family has already carried, is its own kind of weight. What eventually happens to that report matters too. Once a grand jury has reviewed the evidence and reached whatever conclusion it reaches, the findings underneath it typically do become accessible, at least to the extent the law in that jurisdiction allows. That's not a guarantee of a specific timeline, and it's not a promise that every detail becomes public, but it does mean sealed, in this context, is closer to paused than to buried. The family isn't being permanently shut out of their son's own autopsy. They're being asked to wait through a process that, by design, doesn't let anyone, including them, see it early. Now the third thread, and in a lot of ways the one that's traveled the farthest from where this case began. Nolan's parents showed up, unannounced, at a gathering in Cincinnati hosted by the black fraternity Omega Psi Phi. Roughly 100 people turned out at Fountain Square downtown to hear from them directly. Sit with the distance for a second. Horn Island sits nearly 800 miles from that square. This family's fight for answers isn't confined to a courthouse steps in Mississippi anymore. It's reaching rooms and organizations across the country, on their own terms. According to the Cincinnati Enquirer, Christine told that crowd something that's resonated well beyond this single case. That she and Elmore have had to teach their children to move through the world with extra caution and extra awareness in spaces where they're surrounded by people who don't share their background. Not as abstract advice, as something she says she's repeated to her kids for years, long before any of this happened to her own son. Notice the word she reportedly leaned on doing that. Unfortunate, not proud, not certain. A mother naming something she wishes weren't true, and finding herself saying it out loud, in public, to strangers, in the aftermath of losing her son to exactly the kind of situation she'd spent years warning her children about. There's a layer to this worth including, because it adds real depth rather than flattening the story. Nolan's background wasn't a single, simple category. He was Filipino on his mother's side, black on his father's, a young man whose own family reflects the kind of multicultural reality a lot of American households actually live inside. And yet his death has become a flashpoint for a conversation specifically centered on the safety of black children in predominantly white spaces. That's not a contradiction to smooth over. It's a genuine reflection of how identity actually works, rarely as one clean box, more often as something layered that doesn't map neatly onto the bigger conversations it ends up shaping. Christine and Elmore haven't avoided that complexity. They've spoken through it directly. Attorney Ben Crump addressed the same crowd, tying Nolan's case explicitly to the broader fight for black lives in this country, and telling the crowd the search for the truth about what happened to Nolan isn't going to stop. That message isn't new from him. It's the same thread running through every single public appearance he's made on this case, from the first press conferences in Mississippi through the autopsy reveal to now, a rally hundreds of miles away. That consistency isn't incidental. It reads like a strategy built on sustained, repeated pressure rather than a single viral moment. And it's a real part of why this case has moved as visibly as it has compared to so many others that never got this kind of attention. Think about what it actually takes for two grieving parents to do this. It would have been easier, in almost every sense, to keep this fight contained to Mississippi, to the sheriff's office, the DA, the courthouse steps. Instead, Christine and Elmore chose to carry it to a fraternity gathering 800 miles from home, in front of a crowd that never knew their son, and hand their private grief over as a public lesson. That's not a media strategy. It's a decision that the pain of losing Nolan should mean something beyond their own family's fight for answers. That if the world is going to watch this case unfold, it should walk away having learned something real from it. So let's connect all three threads, because none of them are sitting in isolation. An arrest that proves threatening anyone connected to this case carries real federal consequences, separate entirely from the question of how Nolan died. A completed state autopsy, sealed through the same ordinary procedure applied to every comparable death in that county, not evidence of concealment aimed at this family specifically, and two parents who took private grief onto a national stage, turning it into a wider conversation about how families navigate spaces that don't always feel safe for their kids. Here's the honest ledger, tonight. Confirmed. A man has been federally charged for threatening Judge Cole, and that charge carries real legal weight. The state's autopsy is complete and is sitting with the grand jury, unreleased, under standard county procedure. Nolan's parents spoke publicly in Cincinnati about race, caution, and the lessons they'd already taught their children. Still open, whether strangulation played any role in Nolan's death, a possibility that, as you heard directly, cannot currently be ruled out and cannot currently be confirmed either. What the state's sealed report actually says, and underneath everything else, exactly how Nolan ended up in that water in the first place. Not established by anyone with the authority to establish it, a cause of death, a suspect, a charge tied to what actually happened on that island. Nolan Wells was 18. In the space of a few weeks, his name has touched federal law enforcement, forensic pathology, grand jury procedure, and a national conversation about race and safety that stretches far beyond one island off the Mississippi coast. None of those threads, on its own, tells us how he died. Together, they show how far one loss can travel, and how many separate systems are now being asked to deliver the one thing his parents have said, from the very first day, is all they've ever wanted: the truth. It's worth sitting with how much has actually happened since this case first broke, even without the one answer everyone is still waiting for. A federal arrest that didn't exist a few weeks ago, a completed autopsy that didn't exist a few weeks ago. A national platform this family didn't have when they were still standing outside a Mississippi sheriff's office asking basic questions. Movement isn't the same as resolution, and I'm not going to pretend it is just to give tonight's update a tidier ending. But it isn't nothing either. Every one of these threads is a system that's been forced to respond to a family that simply refused to stop asking. His parents are still living inside a version of grief most people never have to imagine. One playing out in courtrooms, in sealed files, and now on stages hundreds of miles from home. And through all of it, the actual question hasn't moved an inch. What happened to their son? We'll bring you that the moment there's something real, sourced and confirmed to report, not a moment before. Subscribe so you're here when it comes. I'll talk to you soon.